So what we're going to cover today is a new feature that was introduced in PowerBuilder 2017 R2, specifically source control with Subversion. First, a legal agenda. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about me for a little bit, and then we're going to talk about the history of support for source control in PowerBuilder. Then we'll look at how we set up Subversion, how we create a repository. The particular tool I'm going to use for this demo is Visual SVN. How to add the PowerBuilder workspace to the Subversion repository. This next item is a bit of a new feature with the way that the Subversion interface was implemented. Big problem we used to have when we were using the old source control systems is that the only thing that was in source control was the raw source files. And if you had a new developer that was coming on and they needed to start working with the project, they couldn't just connect to the source control, download this latest source, and start working. They wouldn't get pibbles. So what they would have to do is they either have to get pibbles from a different developer, or they might have to create the pibbles from source using like OrcaScript. That's not an issue with the way this has been implemented. As you'll see a bit later, the pibbles, the workspace file, a lot of additional items are managed in source control through the PowerBuilder IDE, so that a new developer coming on can download the workspace and all the supplemental files they need directly from source control and begin working immediately. So once we've got basically two workspaces set up, we're going to look at what happens when different developers make source code changes. A bit of an issue that we might encounter with source control systems like Subversion and Git is that it is possible for two developers to make changes to the same object at about the same time and end up with having conflicting source code changes. Most of the systems that PowerBuilder supported prior to this all used exclusive locking, so that you would lock a file and then edit it, and while you had it locked, no other developer could make changes, and so you didn't need to worry about incompatible source code changes. Those incompatible source code changes are called merge conflicts, and so we're going to see how that happens and what we can do with Subversion to avoid this happening. And then we'll have a question and answer session. So, a little bit about me. I think most people on the call probably know who I am. I've been around for quite a while. I was, the original member of Team PowerSoft, then Team Sybase. I'm an SAP mentor, an Appeon MPV. I've been around for a long time, answering questions in forums, writing tech articles, blogs, doing webcasts like this, all talking about PowerBuilder. So enough about me. This is the company I work for. It's called Integrated Data Services. They started in 1997. I didn't join them until 2004. But they initially started with a main application that was based in PowerBuilder, and so that was their bread and butter for quite a while. We still do some PowerBuilder work. The main application that we market, we've since converted to HTML5 JavaScript. We do have a few clients, though, that prefer still to use the client-server version, and so we are still supporting that, just not as widely as we used to. And we've got a few other apps as well, so we are still doing PowerBuilder work. So, enough about me and my company. Let's talk about PowerBuilder. The initial support for source control started about the PowerBuilder 3 days. That is as far as built into the IDE. Before that, you probably checked in pibbles directly in the source code system, which is a not too ideal way to do it, particularly because you might have two developers that have to work on the same different objects, even in the same library. Only one of them really gets to work with the library at a time, because you would end up locking one of those libraries for one of those developers. So that's the reason that the source code interfaces were added to PowerBuilder, so that different developers could work on different objects in the same pibble at the same time. What PowerSoft did originally, when they did this, is they developed drivers that were for specific vendors. And if my memory is correct, the original one was PVCS, which was a big tool at the time. There were some problems with that implementation, though. One of those, in my company, actually, we originally used PVCS with PowerBuilder, is that there would be updates to PVCS, and because the driver was really targeted to a specific version of PVCS, or the APIs in that particular version, if there was an API change, we would have to wait until PowerBuilder was updated to support the later version of PVCS before we could upgrade to it. So that was one issue. The other issue is there might be other tools out there that you want to use for source control, and if it wasn't one that PowerBuilder had a driver for, you were out of luck. For instance, in 2009, we did move to Subversion, but we wouldn't have been able to do that with the method of source control that was originally provided in PowerBuilder. So what happened in PowerBuilder 6 days is that they abandoned those vendor-specific drivers and introduced something called the Microsoft Source Code Control Interface. It's a standard that Microsoft originally developed for interfacing with source control systems. What it is essentially is it's an ODBC for version control. The particular vendor that you want to use, all they have to do is create an API that implements all the methods of the standard. And as long as they've got that API available to you, you can use their product. So it's no longer tied to specific versions or of a product or specific vendors. As long as they've got that API, you can use them. In addition, there was some product out there, and I'll throw out Subversion again, that didn't conform to MSS CCI, it was possible for third-party vendors to create basically a bridge product that would integrate with PowerBuilder and accept the MSS CCI calls, and would convert them to the native source code control vendors API. And that way you could actually use products that didn't support MSS CCI as long as there was a third-party product that provided that bridge. And that's what we did. That's what my company did in 2009 is we got a hold of a bridge product and we moved to Subversion. And we were using Subversion for source control with PowerBuilder. But you don't have to do that anymore because it's 2017. We've released R2. Appion's released R2, and it provides native support for Subversion and Git. And the reason that was important is because the source control landscape has really changed since the PowerBuilder 6 days. Back in the PowerBuilder 6 days, there were still a lot of major vendors out there, proprietary systems that were being used for source control. What's happened since then is a lot of those vendors have really gotten out of the business, and the predominant source control systems nowadays are all open source. And the two big heavy hitters in that space are Subversion and Git. So that's why Appeon decided that native support for Subversion and Git was important. I'll also mention that there will be some changes coming up here in PowerBuilder 2018 as well. That's when support is scheduled to be added for Team Foundation Server. Now, if you use Team Foundation Server, there are actually two version control systems built into it. One of them is Git. So if you are using Git, which is actually the default nowadays when you create a project in Team Foundation Server, if you choose to use Git, you can use the Git interface that's in PowerBuilder 2017 R2. What will be added in PowerBuilder 2018 is support for, if you pardon the term, the legacy version control system, Team Foundation version control, that was originally developed by Microsoft for supporting Visual Studio. So if that's what you're using, there is a bridge product for that from Microsoft, and you can continue to use the MSS CCI that's built into PowerBuilder up until PowerBuilder 2018 comes out, when then you can switch over. I should note that unlike what PowerSoft did when they came out with the MSS CCI, is they removed the native drivers, and you could only use MSS CCI. What Appeon has done is they haven't removed MSS CCI. You can still continue to use that, but now you have support for Subversion and Git as well. So there's two things we primarily need if we're going to start using Subversion for source control. One of them is a Subversion server. You might have an on-premise solution, or you might have a hosted solution, a cloud solution. The product that we went with is called Visual SVN, and it is free for commercial use. There is an enterprise edition, there's a small charge for the enterprise edition, and that's what my company uses actually, because there are some additional features of the enterprise edition that we wanted to have, but you don't have to do that. You can use the standard edition for free. The reason I like it so much, and we went with it, is because I'm a GUI developer. That's why I'm a PowerBuilder developer. I like to point and click my way through stuff. I don't like to sit a command line and type out commands. And I didn't want to have to administer the Subversion server by typing out commands. And so Visual SVN provides a nice GUI interface that allows you to manage the server. As I mentioned, that's what we started using in 2009. The other thing we're going to want is Tortoise SVN. Now, what Tortoise SVN is, it's a plugin for Windows Explorer. See, the issue, and this is kind of related to the previous issue. There are a lot of commands in Subversion, and not all of them are going to be implemented in the PowerBuilder IDE. There's a few now, and when R3 comes out, there'll be a couple more that'll be added as well. But not all of them, not everything you can possibly do in Subversion. Well, you may want to do some of those other things in Subversion. For example, you might want to go back and look at the history of changes to an object and maybe compare changes that were made between two older versions, and perhaps even roll back to a previous version of an object. Those are all operations I doubt you're going to see in the PowerBuilder IDE. And instead of, once again, going to a command line and issuing commands to try to get those operations done, Tortoise SVN, what it does is it allows you to navigate into your source code using Windows Explorer, and then right-clicking on an object, and the Subversion options become available, and you just click on the ones you want, and you just GUI navigate through all the different Subversion options. So that's the other thing you're going to want to install in each of the developers' workstations. Okay, so now we're going to look at creating a repository in Visual SVN, and for that I'm actually going to switch to a machine that has Visual SVN on it, and I've got PowerBuilder there in the background. Now what I've done here is I've actually created a couple users here. These are just local users in this particular server. In an enterprise deployment here, what you probably want to do is go to these authentication options and maybe use Windows Authentication so that the user IDs in Subversion are the same as the user's network IDs. But this is just for this demo. So I'm going to go to the repositories, a branch of this tree view, right-click, say Create New Repository, and I'm going to default most of this stuff to let the defaults take effect here for most of the stuff. I'm going to give it a name, so I'm going to call this SVN Beta. I'm going to create an empty repository. Just for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to leave this as all Subversion users have read-write access. In enterprise deployment, you might want to change that to some other pattern. And that's pretty much it. We get this last dialog. There's a URL there. That's the URL for our repository. I'm going to hit Finish. You can actually right-click here on the repository, and you can copy that URL as well. And the reason I copied that is that we're going to need that here in a minute, because now we're going to go to PowerBuilder, and we're going to check in this workspace into that repository we just created. Now, what you used to do under MSS CCI is you would go to the workspace properties, and there would be the source control tab, and then you would click the drop down and you would see your MSS CCI providers there. Well, notice that's not happening here, because that's not how we get to Subversion and Git. What we're going to do is we're going to go back to the workspace, right click on it, and there's this new Add to Source Control option. We're going to select that. A dialog comes up with Subversion and Git listed in it. We're going to go with Subversion. This next dialog, the reason this thing's already populated is because I've gone through this demo a few times, and so it's actually got this in stored in some in some registry locations for the workspace. But I'm just going to paste in that repository URL and give the username and password for my connection to the repository. I'll hit test. It says it's good. I'll hit OK. And now we get a dialog that shows us what PowerBuilder is going to check in. Now here's a big difference between MSS CCI and Subversion. You'll notice that there's a folder created here, WS Objects, and then for each library in my workspace, it's created a separate subfolder, and underneath there are the actual objects that are in each of those pibbles. I want to make sure I said that right. There's a WS Objects folder. Underneath underneath that folder is a folder for each pibble, and underneath each of those folders is the objects in that pibble. Okay, what you used to need to do, or what was recommended you do when you were using MSS CCI, is you would actually configure your workspace so that there was a separate folder for each library. Because when PowerBuilder did its check-in, check-out, it exported all the source code into those directories, and for performance reasons and also for potential object overwrite reasons, you wouldn't want to keep them all in separate folders because of the way it was exporting source code. You don't have to do that with the Subversion implementation here. It's going to do it for you in the background. So I've got all my libraries all in the same folder, but when it does its check-in and check-out, it's created this folder structure for me where it's going to be dealing with the source code for me. You'll also notice there's some objects here that wouldn't normally be checked in if we were using MSS CCI. The workspace file is getting checked in. The pibbles are getting checked in. And as I mentioned earlier, what this means is that because all of that is checked in, what happens is when a new developer then wants to go ahead and work with this, they can just pull everything down from source control and start using it. And we'll actually see that in a minute. So I'm going to just say this is my initial commit and say OK, and it's done. Okay, what I'm going to do now, just to demonstrate what I was talking about there, is I'm going to go ahead and close this workspace. Now, with that workspace closed, there's a new option that's going to appear now. Connect to workspace. So let's say I'm that other developer now. I'm the new developer, the new guy on the block, and I need to start working on this project. I need to get that URL for that repository. I come into PowerBuilder. With no workspaces open, I can hit connect to workspace. The dialog comes up. I once again type in the URL, my username and password for the project. I hit test connection, and that looks good. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that I create a new folder for this. So I'm going to go create a new folder here. And then let me close this dialog and reopen it so that new folder shows up. Okay, so that's the working directory it's going to use for this workspace. I hit OK, boom, everything's there. Like I said, the developer can start working with the project right away. So let's make some changes. I'm going to take this WMain object, I'm going to open it up, and boy, it's got a bright red background. And the user's complaining, and so I'm going to go in and I'm going to change that to nice button face there. Okay, I'm going to save that change. Now, what you'll notice here on the left in the tree view is there's a check mark in front of the object. Under MSS CCI, what that normally meant is that you had the object locked. That's not what it means here. What it means here is that you've made a change. Okay, we haven't locked this file. And in fact, another developer could go in and make changes. In fact, let's do that. I'm going to close this workspace. I'm going to go back and open the original one again. And I'm going to open that same object. There's my bright red background, and I'm going to change the title here. Okay. And once again, same thing going on. I've got the little check mark there. It means that I've got a modified object. When I go to commit, that's what's going to be sent up to the source control system. So let's go ahead and commit. Okay, so I changed the title here. And notice it's checking in that window. Okay, and everything looks good. Okay, let's go back to that first workspace. Okay, this is the guy who hasn't been committed yet. So I go look at that. It's got the nice gray background. It doesn't have the new title. Let's try to commit that. Changed background color. And, well, if you look down here in the output, well, actually, if you look up here, you'll notice that I've still got a check mark. And you look down here in the output, and you'll see that we got a client error. Target is out of date. So what that means is that while we were editing the object, somebody else made a change, committed, and we're no longer current with what's in the source control system. So what we can do, we can attempt to do a merge here. And the way we do that is we do an update, SVN update. What that's going to do is it's going to go grab that latest change that was made by another developer. It's going to bring it down, and it's going to try to merge the two files together. Now, if the merge is compatible, or at least Subversion thinks the merge is compatible, we'll be fine. It will just tell us that the file's been updated, and then we can go ahead and do our commit. And because now we've got the most recent plus our changes, the commit will work. What's going to happen here, though, is that, notice here it says file conflicted. Subversion's not very forgiving about source code changes that are fairly close to each other in the code. You'll notice I've got it looks like an exclamation point there or something. That's indicating that I've got a conflicted file, that Subversion wasn't able to adequately merge the two changes together. Now, there's nothing we can do here. What we need to do now is go to Tortoise SVN. That's one of the reasons we had to install it. So we're going to go to the folder. I think it's the other folder. Hang on. Yeah, this is what happens when you get a merge conflict. You notice that there's no longer just one wmain file. There's actually 3 wmain files. There is this one, which I believe is ours. There's R2. What the R means is revision, and the number is the commit number. So R2 was the change that actually was before we made our change. And then R3 is the change that the other developer committed. Okay. You don't have to worry about that so much. The main thing you need to know is you need to go to this wmain object, the one that's got the conflict symbol on it. Right click, go to Tortoise SVN, and say Edit Conflicts. And it brings up this dialog. And what it's showing us here is that, that there are 2 changes here. There's a change to the title, and it's a change to the background color. If we're happy with both those changes, we can just say mark as resolved and mark as resolved. Okay, close it. Notice those other 2 files went away. Now I just have the wmain object again. Now I go back in the PowerBuilder. I can do a try to do a refresh. There we go. And notice I've got my check mark again. And if I open this up, I've got the gray background color. Remember, it was red here originally because it's the other developer who made that change. He changed it to gray. Now I've got his change. I've got my uncommitted change now. And so now I'm going to go in and commit that change. Change title, actually. And we're good. See, everything worked. The object's no longer modified, and we got success. Okay, so let's go back to the slides for a second. Okay, and we're going to have to fast forward quite a bit here. I didn't mention this when I was going through the demo there, but after you've made your connection to Subversion, if you do go back to the workspace properties and look under the source control tab, you will find Subversion listed there. I believe that's primarily there just so if you need to go in and make changes to some of the settings, that you've got a place to do that. So let's move through the slides a little bit farther. One thing I'll mention here is that, as I said before, you really want to avoid merge conflicts. I didn't find it particularly pleasant to have to go into the file directories and find the conflicted file and bring up this editor and try to decide what I was going to keep and what I was going to reject. Another issue you may run into is that PowerBuilder sometimes, because it's a GUI, doesn't think that the order of operations in a file necessarily is something that's important. I've noticed at times that I've gone in and made changes to functions and find out later that the functions actually got moved, block moved in the source code. And what that's going to do is that's going to cause some false conflict issues if you've got two developers making changes to functions at the same time. And this dialog could get pretty gnarly. The reason I bring that up is there is a tool. This is an example of what goes bad. What I did is I took two objects, or actually the same object in two different workspaces, workspaces. And in one, it had a series of functions on it, and I added a function in one workspace, and I deleted a function in another workspace, and did both commits and got my merge conflict. And what Subversion is showing me is it thinks that I renamed a function. And if there had been large hunks of code in those functions, I mean, you'd be seeing a lot of red here, because once it thinks that it's looking at a function different than the actual function it's supposed to be looking at, everything beyond that is going to be a false merge conflict, and so this could get really gnarly. Now, one way you can deal with that is there's a nice tool out there called semantic merge, and Tortoise SVN lets you choose what merge tool you want to use. It has one that's built in by default, and that's what you saw. But this tool is particularly nice because when I took that same source code with one function added, one function deleted, and I ran a semantic merge on it, and it actually recognized exactly what happened. It was able to figure out that there were some block code moves and resolve it correctly. And this is just much nicer to look at. It does cost a little bit of money, but if merge conflicts are something you're going to be experiencing in Subversion a lot, that's something that you may want to invest in. What was particularly impressive about this is that semantic merge doesn't know anything about PowerScript. It processed those files as if they were simple text files. A semantic merge does have an external parser API so that anybody can go in and create basically a rule set that knows how to handle the target language. So we could have an external parser tailored for PowerScript that would even make it work even better than it did here. Okay, so what we'd really like to do is not avoid going there entirely. Let's not have merge conflicts. Now, there are ways of doing it. Now, one of the reasons you might have a merge conflict is because when you're using Subversion, it's not like the old MSCCI where it would poll fairly regularly to make sure that you actually had all the all the objects up to date. So what one of the things you're going to want to do is before you go to edit an object, make sure that you're in sync with the source control system. If you haven't done a refresh in a while and some other developers checked in a change, you're going to end up with a source code merge conflict simply because you didn't refresh before you started editing. So that's the first thing I'd recommend. Do a refresh on an object before you start editing it. The other thing we can do is we could lock the files, and so that is supported under Subversion. When we get to Git in a later webcast, we're going to find out that Git does not support that and how to deal with that. But Subversion does support this, and so if you go into the PowerBuilder IDE and you select SVN lock, unfortunately, you end up with this message because locking and unlocking files actually isn't coming in until release 3. That doesn't mean we can't do it. We can still lock the files. We just can't do it through the PowerBuilder IDE. So what we're going to do then is we're going to go back into Subversion and back into Tortoise SVN, and we right-click on the file, go to Tortoise SVN, and there's a Get Lock option, and that will lock the file so that you know that you're the only person that's going to be able to edit it. The problem we'll have until release 3 comes out is that the PowerBuilder IDE doesn't have any lock indication, and it doesn't check for a lock when you go to do editing. What's going to happen is if developer A locks the file, developer B can still open up their workspace, make a change to it. The problem is that when they go to commit, that's when they're going to get an error message. Let me go back here for a minute, but I'll show you that error message in a minute. I didn't want to miss this information. So they'll get an error message indicating that the file's been locked, and then they'll need to need to wait till it's unlocked before they can commit their changes, and chances are they're going to end up with a merge conflict. So one thing you can do though is before you go to edit the object, go to the repro browser. This is another option in Tortoise SVN, and it will tell you whether or not something's locked, and it will actually tell you who's locked it. Okay, so let's say you need to make a change urgently to an object. You can go in and look to see who's got the object locked, and if necessary, now this is kind of a unique feature of Subversion, you can break the lock. So let's say a developer checks out an object and then leaves on vacation for 2 weeks, and you've got an urgent change you need to make. You can go in and break the lock, get the lock, make your changes, commit them, and then when that developer that locked it and went away for 2 weeks comes back from vacation, they're going to have a merge conflict, but you're going to be able to make the change you need to make. In the older MSSCCI, you would often need to get some admin involved to break a lock if somebody locked a file and then wandered away. So this is the error message I was referring to earlier. So developer A locked the file, developer B still went into their workspace, made a change, attempted to do a commit, and then you get the error message that it's already been locked, and so you can't do your commit. Now, ideally, you wouldn't want this to happen. You would want to know in advance that somebody else has already locked a file. And so one of the things you want to do then is make it a habit then to lock the file before editing. Always lock the file before editing. And there's a way you can actually, force maybe a strong word, but teach your developers to get into that habit. And that's to apply what's called an SVN needs lock property on all your PowerBuilder objects that are under source control. That forces the developers to get a lock before they can commit. So even if nobody else has locked the object, if they didn't lock it, they couldn't commit changes against it. And that pretty much trains them, oh yeah, I need to get a lock before I can make any changes because I won't be able to commit if I don't. Now, the problem with that is that you could apply that property. What it does is it marks the local file read-only when that property is applied to the object. And that's how the developer would know, oh, I can't make any changes because the file's marked read-only. Unfortunately, because PowerBuilder is handling the interaction with the files for us, it doesn't actually check to make sure the file's not locked when you go to do editing. So once again, this will be something that will get resolved with R3 when PowerBuilder itself will do the locking for us. So let's say that does get resolved in R3, and now you want to apply that property to all your PowerBuilder code. Well, how do you do it? Well, up to Subversion 1.8, the best way to do that was what's called a pre-commit hook. And so what that means is every time an object was committed, the pre-commit hook would look at it and say, oh, it has to have this property on it, and applies the property. If you've got a later version of Subversion, 1.8 or beyond, 1.9 is the current version, what you can do is you can use an SVN autoprop property, which says that anything that gets checked in has this property. So it makes it really simple. So I hope I haven't scared you too much with the merge conflict issues, but it's something you should be aware of. Once again, if you refresh and lock before you do editing, you will avoid many of those problems. On the other hand, if you don't expect a bunch of developers to be editing the same objects at the same time, you could do away with it. You could just not lock files at all, and 95% of the time you probably wouldn't get a merge conflict because developers would be working in different areas, and the locking would be an unnecessary step. Anyway, so in summary, Subversion interface provided in PowerBuilder 2017 R2 eliminates the need to use bridge products through MSSCI to allow PowerBuilder to use Subversion for source control. You could use Subversion before this, but you'd have to go through MSSCI. And because you were going through a bridge product rather than using the native driver, it was slower. So you should be able to see if you used Subversion in the past from PowerBuilder through MSSCI, you should see that this is faster. And it will eventually provide more complete support for Subversion than is available through the bridge product. But as we've discussed, there is some complexity in the development environment, particularly the potential for merge conflicts. Okay, well, that's all I had, and right now it's time for questions and answers.